Hey guys, tonight we're carefully unrolling the brittle, dusty scrolls of ancient legal codes, not to study the grand foundations of jurisprudence. Oh no, we're on a much more peculiar quest. We're gently prying open the creaking law, books of antiquity, to discover those rules so utterly strange, so wonderfully weird, so bafflingly specific. They'll make your toga tingle, or at least make you chuckle softly into your pillow. Imagine a world where it might be illegal to cry too loudly at a funeral, or where your dog could be put on trial. Frankly, with some of these ancient statutes, you probably wouldn't survive a week back then without inadvertently committing at least 3 bizarre misdemeanors and a truly perplexing felony before breakfast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone's drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You can almost smell it, can't you? That unique aroma of ancient parchment, a blend of dust, dried ink, and the faint, ghostly scent of countless hands that have touched these venerable documents over millennia. The script, perhaps cuneiform indentations on a clay tablet, or elegant hieroglyphs painted on papyrus, or a stern Roman inscription carved into bronze, tells tales not just of kings and conquests, but of the everyday rules that governed ordinary lives. And while many of these laws dealt with serious matters, theft, murder, contract disputes, the kind of things you'd expect, nestled amongst them are an astonishing array of regulations that, to our modern sensibilities, seem utterly outlandish, hilariously specific, or just plain weird. This is where our journey begins, in that shadowy, creaking archive of antiquity's oddest edicts. We're not here to judge, not really. After all, every law, no matter how strange it seems to us now, likely made some kind of sense to the people who drafted it, reflecting their unique beliefs, their societal anxieties, their attempts to impose order on a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. But that doesn't mean we can't have a gentle, sleepy chuckle at their expense, does it? Consider the sheer scope of what ancient lawmakers felt compelled to regulate. It wasn't just about preventing major crimes. Oh no, they delved into the minutiae of daily life with an enthusiasm that is, frankly, quite astonishing. The length of your tunic, the color of your shoes, the type of food you could serve at a dinner party, the precise manner in which you were allowed to grieve, even the noises you were permitted to make in public. All of these, and more, could fall under the stern gaze of the law. It's as if no aspect of human behavior was too trivial, too personal, to escape codification. Why this urge to legislate the seemingly inconsequential? Part of it, perhaps, stems from that deep human desire for order you've encountered before, that need to categorize and control. In societies where the line between the sacred and the secular was often blurred, where divine forces were believed to intervene directly in human affairs, maintaining cosmic harmony could depend on everyone adhering to a complex set of rules, both big and small. A seemingly minor infraction, wearing the wrong kind of hat, for instance, might not just be a fashion faux pas. It could be an affront to the gods, an act that could bring misfortune not just upon the individual, but upon the entire community. This belief that adherence to specific societal norms, including seemingly arbitrary ones, was necessary to maintain divine favor and societal stability is a mainstream historical fact recognized across many ancient cultures. And then there's the simple fact that societies were, well, different. What seems bizarre to us might have been a perfectly logical response to a specific problem or belief in their time. A law prohibiting the wearing of purple by anyone but the emperor might seem like an absurd fashion decree, but it was a powerful way of visually reinforcing imperial authority and social hierarchy. A rule about how many mourners could attend a funeral, or how loudly they could wail, might have been an attempt to curb excessive public displays of grief that were seen as disruptive or even a drain on resources. The sources for these ancient laws are varied and fascinating. We have monumental stone stelae, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, proclaiming laws for all to see. We have fragile papyrus scrolls from Egypt, detailing legal contracts and court proceedings. We have the writings of Greek philosophers and Roman jurists, discussing and debating the intricacies of their legal systems. And sometimes we have accounts from ancient historians or satirists who commented on, and occasionally poked fun at, the more peculiar laws of their own or other cultures. Piecing together this legal jigsaw puzzle and trying to understand the context and intent behind these often strange regulations is a constant and engaging task for historians and classicists. The precise interpretation of some ancient legal texts, especially when the cultural context is not fully understood, or when the language is ambiguous, remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of ancient lawmaking is the occasional show trial, or exemplary punishment for a seemingly minor but symbolically important infraction, designed to send a clear message to the populace about the importance of adhering to even the most peculiar-sounding rules. It wasn't always just about the letter of the law, but the spirit of conformity it was intended to instill. So, prepare to delve into a world where common sense often took a backseat to tradition, where divine pronouncements could dictate your dinner menu, and where the long arm of the law could reach into the most unexpected corners of your life. We'll be tiptoeing through Mesopotamian marketplaces, drifting down the Nile into Pharaoh's court, strolling through Greek agoras, and navigating the bustling forums of Rome, all in search of those wonderfully weird rules that make you go, "They made a law about that?" It's a journey that promises to be as amusing as it is illuminating, a gentle reminder that humanity's quest for order has always had a rather eccentric and often very sleepy side. The great, creaking law book of antiquity is open before us, its pages filled with regulations both profound and profoundly peculiar. Let the toga tingling begin. The dusty scent of those ancient law books still hangs in the air, and our first destination on this journey into legal peculiarity takes us to the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the cradle of some of the world's earliest civilizations. Here, amidst the mud-brick cities of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, you'd find some of the very first attempts to write down comprehensive sets of laws, rules designed to govern an increasingly complex society. And while many of these edicts were concerned with serious matters of justice and commerce, others, when viewed through our modern lens, can seem surprisingly specific, occasionally perplexing, and sometimes, frankly, a little odd. We journey now to the Fertile Crescent, where King Hammurabi of Babylon, among others, laid down his famous and sometimes eyebrow-raising justice. Imagine yourself in the bustling city of Babylon around 1754 BCE. The air is thick with the smell of dust, baking bread from countless household ovens, the scent of livestock, and perhaps the faint, sweet aroma of date palms. You see ziggurats towering over the cityscape, their mud-brick facades shimmering in the heat. In a prominent public place, perhaps near the temple or the city gate, stands a tall black diorite stele, nearly 8 feet high. This is the famous Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest and most complete written legal codes ever discovered. Its surface is covered in meticulously carved cuneiform script, proclaiming nearly 300 laws for all to see, or at least for those who could read, which was a select few. This public display of laws, ensuring, in theory, that justice was transparent and accessible, is a mainstream historical fact about Hammurabi's reign. Many of Hammurabi's laws embody the principle of lex talionis, the an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth concept of retributive justice. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. If he broke another man's bone, his bone shall be broken. This seems straightforward, if rather harsh. But the code also delves into far more specific and sometimes peculiar scenarios. Consider, for instance, laws related to building construction. Law 229 states, if a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he built falls in and kills its owner, then that builder shall be put to death. Fair enough, you might think. Shoddy workmanship. leading to death deserves a severe penalty. But it continues. If it kills the son of the owner, then the son of that builder shall be put to death. This application of vicarious liability, where the builder's innocent son pays the price for his father's negligence, strikes us as profoundly unjust today. But it reflects a different understanding of justice, perhaps rooted in a strong sense of familial responsibility or a desire for exact symmetrical retribution. Then there are the laws concerning tavern keepers, particularly female ones, alewives or female wine sellers, as they were often termed. Law 109 states, if conspirators meet in the house of a female wine seller, and these conspirators are not captured and delivered to the court, the female wine seller shall be put to death. This placed a heavy and potentially lethal burden of policing on tavern owners. It suggests that taverns were seen as potential hotbeds of sedition or criminal activity, and the authorities wanted to ensure that those running such establishments were actively cooperating with the state. It's a rather extreme form of neighborhood watch. Some laws deal with agricultural matters with surprising specificity. If a man hired an ox and killed it through neglect or abuse, he had to replace it ox for ox. If he hired an ox and put out its eye, he had to pay half its value. These are practical rules for an agrarian society. But then you find laws about runaway slaves with very specific rewards for their capture and return, highlighting the importance of slave labor in the Mesopotamian economy. The sheer detail in some of these laws, covering everything from disputes over irrigation ditches to the fees payable to surgeons for successful operations, and the penalties, like cutting off the surgeon's hands if the patient died under their care due to negligence, paints a vivid picture of a society grappling with the complexities of urban life and a hierarchical social structure. One quirky, lesser-known type of Mesopotamian legal provision, found in earlier Sumerian law codes, like the Code of Ur-Nammu, c. 2100-2050 BCE, involves penalties for what we might consider social slights or minor assaults. For instance, if a man knocked out another man's tooth, he had to pay 2 shekels of silver. If he cut off another man's foot, 10 shekels. While still following a principle of compensation, these earlier codes sometimes favored monetary fines over strict eye for an eye physical retribution, especially for offenses between social equals. The precise evolution and reasoning behind the shift towards more literal talionic justice in Hammurabi's time compared to these earlier, often more compensatory systems is a subject historians of ancient law continue to explore. The laws also reveal a society deeply concerned with contracts and commercial transactions. There were detailed rules about loans, deposits, partnerships, and the responsibilities of merchants and agents. False accusations were taken very seriously. If someone accused another of a capital crime but could not prove it, the accuser himself would be put to death. This was a powerful deterrent against malicious or frivolous charges. And what about family law? Hammurabi's code has extensive sections on marriage, divorce, inheritance, and adoption. Adultery by a wife was punishable by drowning, though the husband could choose to spare her if the king also pardoned her lover. A man could divorce his wife if she was barren or gadding about and neglecting her home, though he usually had to return her dowry and sometimes pay a fine. These laws, while reflecting the patriarchal nature of Mesopotamian society, also provided certain protections and rights for women, at least within the established social framework. As you stand before that imposing black stele, or imagine yourself listening to a scribe read out these edicts in a dusty Mesopotamian town square, you get a sense of a society striving for order, for a clear set of rules to govern every aspect of life. Some of those rules seem harsh, others strangely specific, and a few, like the one about the builder's son, profoundly unsettling to our modern moral compass. But they all offer a fascinating glimpse into the minds of these ancient lawmakers, grappling with the timeless human challenges of justice, responsibility, and how to live together in a complex, often precarious world. The Fertile Crescent wasn't just fertile for crops, it was fertile ground for some of history's earliest and most intriguing legal experiments. The sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, with their stern cuneiform edicts, begin to fade from your mind's eye. and you find yourself drifting southwards, down the long, life-giving artery of a mighty river. The air grows warmer, scented with lotus, blossoms, river mud, and the faint, dry aroma of papyrus. You are floating down the Nile, entering the ancient enigmatic land of Egypt, a civilization ruled by god-kings, pharaohs whose pronouncements were not just law, but divine decree. Here, under the watchful gaze of towering pyramids and inscrutable sphinxes, you'll discover a legal landscape where finicky fiats governed everything from the worship of sacred cats, don't even think about harming one, to the precise and, often very loud, manner in which one was expected to mourn the dead. Imagine yourself in a bustling Egyptian city like Thebes or Memphis, perhaps during the New Kingdom, roughly 1550–1070 BCE. The streets are a vibrant tapestry of colour and activity. You see priests in clean white linen robes, soldiers in short kilts carrying spears, merchants haggling over goods in crowded marketplaces, and artisans crafting exquisite jewellery or carving intricate hieroglyphs. Towering over it all are the immense temples, their walls covered in vibrant reliefs depicting gods, pharaohs, and scenes from daily life and the afterlife. The pharaoh is not just a king, he is a living god, Horus incarnate, the intermediary between the divine realm and the mortal world. His word is law, ma'at, the concept of cosmic order, truth, and justice, personified. While comprehensive legal codes like Hammurabi's are less common from ancient Egypt, or at least fewer have survived, we have a wealth of evidence from tomb, inscriptions, papyrus documents, like court records, wills, and marriage contracts, and administrative texts that reveal a complex legal system deeply intertwined with religious belief and royal authority. One of the most famous, and to us, perhaps peculiar, aspects of Egyptian reverence that had legal implications was their veneration of certain animals, particularly cats. Cats were associated with the goddess Bastet, a protective deity often depicted with the head of a lioness or a domestic cat. They were prized for their ability to control vermin, protecting homes and granaries. Harming a cat, even accidentally, was a very serious offense, sometimes punishable by death. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, recounts witnessing a Roman soldier in Egypt being killed by an angry mob for accidentally killing a cat, despite pleas from officials. While this account is from a later period, it reflects the deep-seated reverence for felines. This extraordinary protection afforded to cats is a mainstream historical fact about ancient Egyptian culture. When a household cat died, the entire family would mourn, often shaving their eyebrows as a sign of grief. The cats were even mummified with the same care as humans, sometimes buried in vast cat cemeteries. Mourning practices for humans were also subject to strict, if sometimes unwritten, rules and expectations which carried social, if not always strictly legal in our sense, weight. Upon the death of a prominent individual, especially the pharaoh or a high official, public displays of grief were elaborate and often highly performative. Professional mourners, usually women, would be hired to wail, tear their clothes, beat their chests, and throw dust on their heads, creating a loud and dramatic spectacle. Herodotus, the Greek historian, describes these mourning processions in vivid detail. While perhaps not a finicky fiat from the pharaoh himself in every instance, the societal expectation for such demonstrative grief was powerful, and failing to participate appropriately could lead to social censure or suspicion of disloyalty. The pharaoh's decrees could cover a vast range of subjects: land ownership, taxation, irrigation rights, and labor obligations, such as conscription for building projects like the pyramids or temples, were all regulated by royal edict. Justice was often administered by local officials or viziers acting in the pharaoh's name. We have records of court cases dealing with theft, assault, tomb robbery, a particularly heinous crime, and disputes over inheritance. Punishments could be severe, ranging from fines and confiscation of property to beatings, mutilation, like cutting off the nose or ears, forced labor in the mines, or execution, One quirky, lesser-known aspect of Egyptian legal or quasi-legal practice involved letters to the dead. If someone felt they had been wronged by a deceased person, or if they needed the intercession of an ancestor in some matter, they might write a letter on a papyrus scroll or a pottery shard, addressing it to the dead individual and leave it at their tomb. These letters often outlined the grievance or request and implored the spirit of the deceased to intervene from the afterlife, perhaps by appealing to the gods or by ceasing to cause trouble for the living. While not a formal legal process, it was a recognized way of seeking redress or resolution beyond the confines of earthly courts, reflecting the strong belief in the ongoing influence of the dead. Religious law, or rather, the rules governing temple rituals and priestly conduct, were also paramount. Temples were not just places of worship. They were major economic institutions, owning vast tracts of land and employing large numbers of people. The priests had to maintain ritual purity, perform the daily offerings to the gods correctly, and manage the temple estates. Any dereliction of duty or sacrilege could have severe consequences, both divine and temporal. The precise details of many temple regulations and the extent to which they were codified versus passed down through oral tradition are still areas of active Egyptological research. The concept of ma'at was central to the Egyptian worldview. Every action, from the pharaoh's decrees to the conduct of an ordinary peasant, was ideally meant to uphold ma'at, to maintain the delicate balance of cosmic order. Laws were seen as tools to ensure this harmony. Therefore, acts that disrupted ma'at, whether it was lying in court, cheating in business, or showing disrespect to the gods or the pharaoh, were serious offenses. As you drift along the majestic Nile, past colossal statues and towering temple pylons, you can sense the immense power of the pharaoh and the gods he represented. The laws of this land were not just human constructs. They were reflections of a divine order, an order that extended to the proper treatment of sacred animals, the elaborate performance of mourning, and the meticulous observance of countless rituals. To live in ancient Egypt was to live in a world where the finicky fiats of the divine ruler and the unwritten rules of religious propriety governed every aspect of your existence, ensuring that both your earthly life and your journey into the afterlife proceeded according to the ancient, sacred plan. The warm, lotus-scented air of Egypt, with its divine pharaohs and sacred animal laws, gradually gives way to a different Mediterranean breeze, one carrying the scent of olive groves, the sea, and perhaps the faint intellectual aroma of philosophical debate. You find yourself strolling through the sun-drenched landscapes of ancient Greece, a land of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own unique character, customs, and, of course, its own set of often peculiar laws. From the bustling agora of democratic Athens to the stark, disciplined military barracks of oligarchic Sparta, you'll uncover legal systems that, while aiming for order and justice, sometimes achieved comedic levels of peculiarity or veered into what we might consider rather startling lapses in legal logic. Let's first wander into Athens, the cradle of democracy, philosophy, and drama. Here, in the shadow of the Acropolis, the laws were, at least in theory, made by the citizens themselves, though citizen was a rather exclusive category, excluding women, slaves, and foreigners. Athenian law was complex and covered a vast range of human activity, but alongside sensible rules about contracts and property, you'd find some rather eyebrow-raising statutes. Consider, for instance, the laws surrounding impiety, asebeia. While Athens prided itself on its intellectual freedom, disrespecting the gods, profaning sacred objects or mysteries, or introducing new, unauthorized deities could lead to severe penalties, including exile or even death. The famous trial and execution of Socrates in 399 BCE, accused of corrupting the youth and impiety, is a stark reminder of this. What constituted impiety could be rather vaguely defined, making it a potentially dangerous charge. This concern with maintaining the traditional religious order through legal means is a mainstream historical fact of Athenian society. Then there were laws attempting to regulate public behavior and extravagance. Sumptuary laws, designed to curb excessive displays of wealth, particularly at funerals or weddings, were common in many Greek city-states, including Athens. These might limit the number of mourners, the cost of funeral garments, or the lavishness of wedding feasts. The aim was often to prevent social unrest caused by conspicuous consumption, or to promote a sense of civic equality, though their effectiveness was often questionable. Imagine being fined because your funeral procession was deemed a tad too ostentatious. One particularly quirky Athenian legal process was ostracism. Once a year, if the assembly decided, citizens could vote to banish any individual they considered a threat to the state or too powerful for a period of 10 years. Each citizen would write the name of the person they wished to ostracize on a potsherd, ostracon. If a sufficient number of votes were cast, typically 6,000 against one individual, that person, no matter how prominent, would be exiled. While intended as a safeguard for democracy, it could also be used as a tool for political vendettas, a rather dramatic way to get rid of your rivals. The fate of prominent figures like Themistocles and Aristides, who were ostracized at various points, attests to the real-world impact of this unusual law. Now, let's take a short, sharp turn to Sparta, Athens' militaristic rival. If Athenian laws sometimes seemed a bit fussy, Spartan laws were in a league of their own when it came to peculiar austerity and social engineering. Lycurgus, the legendary Spartan lawgiver, whose historical existence is still debated by scholars, was credited with creating a system designed to produce the ultimate warrior state. Spartan laws governed every aspect of a citizen's life, from birth to death, with an iron fist. Babies deemed weak or deformed by the state elders were reportedly exposed to die on a mountainside, a brutal form of eugenics. Boys were taken from their families at the age of 7 to live in military barracks, undergoing a famously harsh training regime, the agoras, designed to instill discipline, obedience, and endurance. They were deliberately underfed, encouraging them to steal food, though they were punished if caught, not for stealing, but for being clumsy enough to get caught. A rather unique moral lesson. Spartan sumptuary laws were even stricter than Athens. Ostentatious displays of wealth were forbidden. Even their currency was made of clumsy iron rods, supposedly to discourage the accumulation of riches and make theft impractical. Luxury was anathema. Spartans ate simple, unappetizing meals in communal messes, the most famous or infamous dish being black broth, a concoction of pork, blood, salt, and vinegar that other Greeks found utterly revolting. One can only imagine there wasn't a law against enjoying black broth, but perhaps there should have been. One quirky, lesser-known Spartan law or custom involved their attitude towards speech. Laconic wit, brief, pithy, and often dryly humorous utterances was highly prized. Long-windedness was despised. While perhaps not a formally codified law, the social pressure to be concise and to the point was immense. It's a rather charming, if perhaps intimidating, approach to public discourse. Marriage customs in Sparta also had their peculiar, almost ritualistic aspects. A bridegroom would capture his bride in a mock abduction. The bride would have her hair cropped short and be dressed in men's clothes on her wedding night, waiting for her husband to sneak away from his barracks to visit her. These customs, so different from those in other Greek cities, were all part of the unique Spartan system, designed to prioritize loyalty to the state and the military collective above all else. Whether all these reported Spartan laws and customs were as rigidly enforced or as universally practiced as some ancient sources suggest is a topic of ongoing scholarly discussion. Our knowledge of Sparta is often filtered through the writings of non-Spartans, like Plutarch or Xenophon, who may have idealized or exaggerated certain aspects. Nevertheless, the overall picture is one of a society that willingly or forcibly submitted to an extraordinary degree of legal and social control in pursuit of military excellence. So, as you stroll through these contrasting Greek city-states, From the sometimes overly litigious and philosophically argumentative Athenians to the starkly disciplined and often bizarrely austere Spartans, you see that the quest for order and the good society could lead down some very strange legal paths. The Greeks gave us democracy and profound philosophy, but they also gave us laws that make you tilt your head and wonder, really? A testament to the wonderfully varied and occasionally baffling tapestry of human attempts to govern themselves. The sun-drenched agoras of Greece, with their philosophical debates and sometimes baffling local laws, begin to fade into a more expansive, more imposing vista. You feel the ground beneath your feet become paved with sturdy, well-maintained roads, stretching out in all directions. The language around you shifts to the stern, practical cadences of Latin. You have arrived in Rome, the heart of a vast empire whose legal system would, in time, form the very bedrock of Western civilization. Yet, amidst the grand principles of Roman law, the res publica and the later imperial decrees, you'll discover a surprising number of regulations so specific, so oddly focused, or so seemingly trivial, that they might make even the most stoic Roman senator crack a dignified if sleepy snicker. The Roman legal system was a monumental achievement, evolving over centuries from the early 12 tables, c. 451–450 BCE, a foundational codification of existing customs, through the complex jurisprudence of the Republic, to the vast compilations of law under emperors like Justinian in the 6th century CE. Roman law dealt with everything from property rights and contracts, areas where its influence is still profoundly felt, to criminal offences and family matters. But as with all ancient societies, the Romans couldn't resist the urge to legislate some of the more peculiar aspects of life. Consider, for instance, some of the regulations surrounding funerals, a topic you've touched upon before in terms of appeasing spirits. Roman law, at various times, sought to control the extravagance of funerals, much like the Greeks. The 12 tables themselves included provisions limiting the number of flute players at a funeral to 10, and forbidding women from scratching their cheeks or making loud, ostentatious lamentations. This wasn't just about decorum. It was likely an attempt to curb excessive displays of wealth by aristocratic families, which could fuel social tensions, and perhaps also to prevent public grief from becoming too disruptive. Imagine a Roman matron being sternly reminded by a lictor that her wailing was exceeding the legally prescribed decibel level. Then there were the laws concerning public order and decency, which could be surprisingly specific. For example, there were edicts against certain types of public nuisances. While perhaps not always codified with the same formality as major laws, local magistrates had considerable power to regulate day-to-day life. You might find rules about not throwing refuse into the streets from upper-story windows, a perennial problem in crowded ancient cities, or restrictions on noisy workshops in residential areas. The precise details of these urban regulations often come to us through incidental references in literature or inscriptions, painting a picture of officials constantly trying to manage the chaotic vitality of a city like Rome. This focus on urban administration and public works, including sanitation and order, is a mainstream historical fact of Roman governance. One area where Roman law could get particularly finicky was in defining status and privilege. Sumptuary laws dictating who could wear what were a recurring feature, which you'll explore in more detail soon. But beyond clothing, there were rules about who could use certain types of carriages, who was entitled to a specific number of attendants, or even who had the right of way on a crowded street. These weren't just about practicalities. They were about visibly reinforcing the complex social hierarchy that underpinned Roman society. A quirky, lesser-known aspect of Roman legal thinking, or at least legalistic tradition, involved the concept of infamia. This wasn't a specific crime, but rather a loss of legal or social standing, a kind of public disgrace that could result from certain professions, like actors, gladiators, or prostitutes, or from being found guilty of certain offences, like fraud or calumny. A person declared infamy suffered various legal disabilities, such as being unable to hold public office, act as a witness in some cases, or represent others in court. While the specific criteria for infamia evolved over time, The idea that one's profession or moral conduct could have direct legal consequences beyond criminal penalties is a fascinating insight into Roman social values. What about truly bizarre, individual laws? While it's important to be cautious about apocryphal tales or laws taken out of context, Roman history does offer some contenders. For instance, there are references to an ancient, and likely long obsolete by the classical period, law from the 12 tables that supposedly allowed creditors to cut up the body of a defaulting debtor and divide the pieces amongst themselves, if payment was not made after a certain period. Historians still debate the literal interpretation of this law. Was it a genuine, if barbaric, practice, or a symbolic threat designed to ensure debts were taken very seriously? The ambiguity and horror of it certainly make it memorable. There were also laws related to magic and divination. While official, state-sanctioned divination, like augury, was a cornerstone of Roman religion, private, unauthorized fortune-telling, or the practice of harmful magic, maleficium, was often viewed with suspicion and could be subject to severe penalties, especially if it was perceived as a threat to public order or the well-being of individuals. The line between acceptable religious practice and illicit superstition could be a fine one, and Roman authorities were often keen to control it. Even building regulations in Rome could have their peculiar sides. With the city constantly growing and prone to fires, like the Great Fire of 64 CE under Nero, there were rules about the height of buildings, the materials to be used, and the width of streets to act as fire breaks. While sensible in principle, enforcing these regulations in a sprawling, densely populated metropolis would have been a constant challenge, and undoubtedly led to some very specific and perhaps frustratingly bureaucratic edicts for property owners. As you wander the marble-paved forum, or navigate the narrow, bustling streets of a Roman insular apartment block, you are surrounded by a legal system of immense power and sophistication. But amidst the grand pronouncements on citizenship, property, and empire, you can also detect the faint, rustling echoes of these more peculiar regulations. The rules about wailing too loudly, the anxieties about a builder's shoddy work, the careful delineation of who could wear what. These ridiculous Roman regulations, far from undermining the majesty of Roman law, actually add another layer to its richness, revealing the very human concerns, the societal quirks, and the sometimes surprising attempts to micromanage life in one of history's greatest empires. The grand, sometimes surprisingly finicky, edifice of Roman law begins to fade, and your attention is drawn to a particular category of ancient legislation that seems to pop up with amusing regularity across cultures, laws about what you could and absolutely could not put on your body. You are now unraveling the curious, often intricate, and sometimes downright baffling ancient attire acts. The fashion police of antiquity, who dictated everything from the color of your cloak to the style of your sandals, lest you offend the gods, public decency, or perhaps most importantly, the delicate social hierarchy. Imagine yourself in ancient Rome again, perhaps during the Republic or the early Empire. You're getting dressed for the day. It's not just a matter of personal preference or what's clean. Oh no, the toga you wear, if you're a male citizen, is not just a garment. It's a statement of status. Its whiteness, its drape, even the width of its purple stripe, clavus, if you were a senator or an equestrian, were all carefully regulated or, at the very least, dictated by powerful social custom that had the force of law. For example, the toga praetexta, with its broad purple border, was reserved for magistrates, certain priests, and freeborn boys. To wear it without entitlement would be a serious transgression, and only the emperor in later periods could wear a toga entirely of purple, a color derived from expensive murex shellfish dye, making it the ultimate symbol of imperial power. This strict regulation of purple dye, associating it with royalty and high status, is a mainstream historical fact across many ancient and later societies, not just Rome. But it wasn't just about purple. Sumptuary laws, as you've briefly encountered, were enacted at various times in Rome and in many other ancient cultures, including Greece and even some in Asia, to restrict extravagance in dress as well as in food and other forms of consumption. These laws might specify the types of fabrics that could be used, no excessive silk for the lower classes, the amount of gold embroidery permitted, or even the cost of a single garment. The stated aims were often to promote public virtue, curb moral decay, as luxury was often seen as corrupting, prevent jealousy between social classes, or even to protect local industries. Whether they were ever truly effective is another matter. People have always found ways to flaunt their wealth or express their individuality. Laws or no laws. Consider ancient Sparta, that paradise of austerity you visited earlier. Their legendary lawgiver Lycurgus supposedly forbade citizens from wearing any adornment at all and insisted on simple, uniform clothing, typically a single rough woolen cloak, the tribon for men. This was designed to eliminate distinctions of wealth and foster a sense of equality and martial simplicity. Imagine a Spartan fashionista trying to express herself. It would have been a very short and likely very sternly corrected career. In ancient Egypt, while perhaps less overtly legislated in the form of sumptuary laws as in Rome, clothing was still highly indicative of social status and profession. Priests wore specific linen garments, often white, symbolizing purity. The pharaoh would be depicted in elaborate regalia, including the distinctive Nemes headdress and various crowns. Even the type and quality of jewelry worn would signal one's place in society. While a peasant might wear simple faience beads, a noble would sport elaborate collars of gold and precious stones. These weren't necessarily laws in our sense, but powerful unwritten codes of attire. One quirky, lesser-known example of ancient attire regulation comes from some interpretations of Hittite law from Anatolia around the 16th–13th centuries BCE. Certain texts seem to suggest rules about how different social classes or officials should be clothed, perhaps even specifying colors or types of garments for specific occasions or roles. The details are often fragmentary, but they hint at a society where clothing was a carefully managed signifier of identity and rank. The precise extent to which these were enforced legal statutes versus strong customary norms is still a subject of Hittitological study. What about footwear? Even your sandals could be subject to scrutiny. In Rome, for instance, certain types of elaborate or brightly coloured sandals might be considered inappropriate for respectable matrons or senators, perhaps deemed too frivolous or foreign. Soldiers, of course, wore sturdy military boots, the caligae, and slaves would often go barefoot or wear very simple footwear. Your shoes, or lack thereof, immediately told a story about who you were. Hairstyles, too, could fall under the purview of unwritten, if not written, law. In Rome, respectable women were expected to wear their hair modestly coiffed, often covered with a veil, palla, when in public. Elaborate, attention-grabbing hairstyles might be associated with courtesans or women of questionable morals. Men, during certain periods of the Republic, favoured short, practical haircuts, while long hair might be seen as effeminate or a sign of barbarian influence. The Emperor Augustus, for example, promoted a fairly simple, classic hairstyle as part of his program of restoring traditional Roman virtues. And it wasn't just about what you couldn't wear. Sometimes laws or strong customs dictated what you had to wear. Certain priests had to wear specific headdresses or ritual garments. Mourners, as you've seen, had prescribed or prescribed attire. Soldiers on duty were, of course, in uniform. These sartorial requirements reinforced group identity and the solemnity or importance of particular roles or occasions. As you picture these ancient citizens carefully selecting their outfits, not just for comfort or style, but to avoid a fine social ostracism or even divine displeasure, you realize that getting dressed in antiquity could be a surprisingly complex and anxiety-ridden affair. These ancient attire acts, whether formal laws or unyielding customs, reveal societies deeply concerned with order, hierarchy, and the powerful symbolic language of clothing. Your tunic, your cloak, your shoes, even the way you wore your hair, were all part of a public performance, a constant declaration of who you were and where you belonged in the intricate social fabric of the ancient world. Forget dress too. impress. In many ancient societies, it was dress according to statute or else. The rustle of ancient fabrics and the stern pronouncements of antiquity's fashion police begin to fade, and your attention, perhaps a little peckish by now, turns towards the dining tables and market stalls of bygone eras. Just as ancient lawmakers had strong opinions about what you could wear, they often had equally firm and sometimes utterly perplexing ideas about what you could, or more often, could not eat. We'll now nibble our way, very carefully, through a selection of ancient culinary codes and curious consumption laws, designed to ensure your historical hunger is appropriately sated, not accidentally summoned by some divinely prohibited dish or overly extravagant feast. Imagine yourself in ancient Rome again, invited to a grand dinner party. You might expect a lavish spread, and often you'd get one. But at various times, Roman authorities, concerned about excessive luxury and perceived moral decay, that old chestnut, enacted sumptuary laws that specifically targeted food. The Lex Fania, 161 BCE, for instance, aimed to limit spending on banquets. It reportedly restricted the number of guests, the types of poultry that could be served, sparing the fattened hen for some reason, unless it was just one per table, and not force-fed, and even the amount of silver plate that could be displayed. Later laws, like the Lex Aemilia, 115 BCE, further tried to regulate the specific dishes and ingredients permissible at feasts. Enforcing these laws must have been a caterer's nightmare. Did they have inspectors peeking into dining rooms, counting chickens? It's a charmingly officious image. This Roman preoccupation with legislating against luxury at the dinner table is a well-documented mainstream historical fact, reflecting anxieties about wealth disparity and the perceived decline of traditional Roman austerity. Moving across to ancient Greece, you might recall the Pythagorean reluctance to eat beans. While the exact reasons remain shrouded in philosophical mystery, it functioned as a powerful dietary taboo for followers of Pythagoras. But other Greek city-states also had their food-related quirks. In Sparta, the famously austere black broth, that unappetizing concoction of pork, blood, and vinegar, wasn't just a culinary choice. It was a legally enforced part of the communal messing system, the syssitia, designed to foster equality and discourage individual indulgence. You didn't get to choose your menu if you were a Spartan citizen. You ate what the state deemed appropriate for a warrior. One can only imagine the hushed grumbling, or perhaps the resigned sighs, around those Spartan dinner tables. Ancient Egypt, with its deep connection between religion and daily life, also had its share of dietary restrictions, often tied to priestly, purity, or specific deities. Herodotus tells us that Egyptian priests were forbidden to eat fish or beans. Certain animals were considered sacred to particular gods and therefore taboo to consume, at least by those involved in their cults. For example, those who worshipped the goddess Isis might avoid pork. The exact extent and universality of these taboos among the general population is still a subject of Egyptological research, but they highlight how religious belief could directly shape the dinner plate. Beyond specific ingredients, there were sometimes laws or strong customs about how food should be prepared or consumed. In some cultures, rules about ritual slaughter were paramount, ensuring that meat was fit for consumption according to religious principles. The sharing of food, too, often had ritualistic or symbolic importance, and failing to observe the correct etiquette could be a serious social, if not always legal, offence. One quirky, lesser-known example of a food-related prohibition comes from some interpretations of early Irish law, the Bran Laws, compiled mostly between the 7th and 8th centuries CE, though reflecting older traditions. These complex texts supposedly contained provisions about crimes of the lips, which could include not just slander, but also things like eating certain foods in a way that was considered gluttonous or socially inappropriate, or even making excessive noise while eating. While perhaps not a law in the strictest sense of a state-enforced statute, it reflects a societal concern with table manners and moderation that could carry social penalties. What about drink? Alcohol, while widely consumed in many ancient societies, was also sometimes subject to regulation, particularly concerning its quality, its sale, or public drunkenness. You've already encountered Hammurabi's rather strict rules for female wine cellars. In Rome, while wine was a staple, there were concerns about adulteration, and excessive public inebriation was generally frowned upon, at least for respectable citizens. Sumptuary laws might also limit the types or quantities of expensive imported wines that could be served at banquets. And sometimes, the laws weren't about prohibiting foods, but about ensuring their fair distribution or quality. Many ancient cities had officials, like the Roman aediles, who were responsible for overseeing the markets, ensuring fair weights and measures, and preventing the sale of spoiled or adulterated food. These regulations were crucial for public health and maintaining social order, especially in densely populated urban centers. As you imagine navigating these ancient culinary landscapes, carefully considering whether that particular type of fish is taboo today, or if the number of dormice on your plate exceeds the legal limit, you realize that eating in antiquity wasn't always a simple matter of satisfying hunger. It was often a complex interplay of religious belief, social status, legal prescription, and deeply ingrained custom. These culinary codes and curious consumption laws offer a fascinating taste of the diverse ways ancient societies sought to regulate one of life's most fundamental activities, ensuring that what went into your mouth was not just nourishing, but also, in their eyes, proper, pious, and perhaps, just perhaps, not too extravagantly delicious. Having carefully navigated the treacherous waters of ancient dietary laws, ensuring your historical hunger was satisfied without accidentally offending a deity or a sumptuary inspector, your attention now shifts to the bustling, often chaotic, public spaces of antiquity. Just as lawmakers worried about what you wore and ate, they were also deeply concerned with maintaining public order and decorum. You're about to discover a fascinating array of often baffling rules designed to police ancient personal space and public behavior, from laws attempting to curb excessive wailing at funerals, a familiar theme, to potential prohibitions on certain types of annoyingly noisy sandals. Imagine yourself trying to make your way through the crowded, narrow streets of a Roman insular district, or the vibrant, jostling marketplace of an ancient Greek agora. The sheer density of people, animals, and activity would have been overwhelming. It's no surprise, then, that authorities often felt the need to lay down rules to try and manage this human hubbub and prevent minor irritations from escalating into major disturbances. You've already encountered the Roman attempts to limit excessive lamentations at funerals. This wasn't just about curbing ostentatious displays of grief by wealthy families. It was also about maintaining public peace. Imagine trying to conduct your daily business or get a moment's rest when the streets are filled, day after day, with loud performative wailing, flute playing, and chest beating. Such laws, like those in the 12 tables, aim to keep public mourning within socially acceptable and audibly tolerable limits. It's a rather practical, if somewhat unsympathetic, approach to managing public emotion. What about other noises? While specific laws against noisy sandals might be more in the realm of humorous speculation than concrete historical fact for most major civilizations, the general principle of magistrates having the authority to curb excessive or disruptive noise certainly existed. Think of the blacksmith's hammering, the coppersmith's banging, or the loud cries of street vendors you heard about earlier. In residential areas, or at certain times of day, especially at night, local officials could and likely did intervene if such noises became a persistent public nuisance. We have evidence from Roman legal texts and inscriptions of disputes and regulations concerning noise from workshops, taverns, or even overly boisterous neighbors. The desire for a bit of peace and quiet, it seems, is timeless. Public assembly and movement were also often regulated. In Rome, for instance, certain types of wheeled traffic were restricted in the city centre during daylight hours to reduce congestion and noise. This meant that heavy goods had to be transported at night, adding to the nocturnal cacophony, but perhaps making the daytime streets slightly more navigable for pedestrians. Processions, whether religious or triumphal, would have required careful organization and probably official permission to avoid gridlocking the city. This concern for traffic flow and the regulation of public thoroughfares is a mainstream historical fact of urban life in large ancient cities. Personal comportment in public could also be subject to scrutiny, if not always formal laws. In Athens, for example, a citizen was expected to maintain a certain dignity and self-control in public. Outbursts of extreme emotion, public drunkenness, at least for respectable citizens during daylight hours, or overly boisterous behavior could lead to social disapproval, even if not always a legal penalty. The ideal was often one of moderation and decorum. One quirky, lesser-known area of potential public policing might involve things like spitting or other unhygienic behaviors in public places. While specific laws against spitting might be hard to pin down for every ancient culture, general concerns about public cleanliness and the spread of disease, even without a full understanding of germ theory, could lead to informal social pressures, or even local magisterial edicts against particularly unsanitary habits, especially in sacred areas like temple precincts. The precise extent to which such minor nuisance behaviors were actively policed is a subject that often relies on piecing together fragmentary evidence from various sources, including satirical literature, which often highlighted common annoyances. What about personal space in a literal sense? In crowded marketplaces or at public games, jostling and unintentional bumping were likely unavoidable. However, deliberate pushing, shoving, or aggressive behavior that infringed on another's space could certainly lead to disputes and potentially fall under laws related to assault or public affray, depending on the severity. The Roman concept of inuria, injury or outrage, was quite broad and could cover not just physical harm, but also insults or acts that damaged someone's reputation or dignity, many of which would occur in public settings. Consider also the rules surrounding sacred spaces. Temple precincts, shrines, and other holy sites often had very specific rules of conduct. Visitors might be required to be ritually pure, having washed or avoided certain activities, to wear specific attire or remove footwear, to abstain from loud talking or disruptive behavior, and to show proper reverence. Violating these rules could be a serious offense, an act of impiety that could anger the gods and bring down their wrath. Temple inscriptions sometimes explicitly listed these prohibitions for all to see. As you navigate these ancient public squares, temples and marketplaces, trying not to wail too loudly, make too much noise with your hypothetically squeaky sandals, or accidentally offend a passing dignitary by not giving way properly, you realize that public life in antiquity was a carefully choreographed dance. The rules, whether written laws or unwritten customs, were designed to keep the complex machinery of urban society running as smoothly as possible, to minimize friction, and to ensure that individual behavior did not unduly disrupt the peace, piety, or perceived order of the community. It was a world where your personal space and your personal noise levels were very much a matter of public concern. The bustling, sometimes cacophonous, public spaces of antiquity, with their rules about noise and decorum, begin to fade, and you find yourself drifting into a truly peculiar corner of ancient legal history. The courtroom where the accused is not a human, but an animal. Yes, you read that correctly. Prepare to delve into the rather perplexing, and to our modern minds, utterly baffling historical instances where animals found themselves on the wrong side of the law, sometimes even facing formal trial, conviction, and punishment, as if they possessed the same moral agency and legal culpability as a human being. This practice, known as animal trials, has a surprisingly long and widespread history, though it reached its most elaborate and well-documented peak in Europe during the medieval and early modern periods. However, traces and antecedents of this idea, that animals could be held responsible for harm they caused, or could be ritually implicated in human transgressions, can be found in some ancient societies, or at least in attitudes and practices, that blur the lines between human and animal culpability. Consider ancient Greece. While formal trials of animals in the later medieval sense were not a standard feature of Athenian or Spartan law, there are hints of similar concepts. For instance, in Athenian law, an inanimate object, like a falling statue or a weapon, that caused a death could be tried and, if found guilty, formally exiled or cast beyond the city borders in a ritual of purification. This practice, conducted at a special court called the Prytaneion, wasn't about punishing the object itself, but about ritually cleansing the community of the pollution caused by the death. It's not a huge leap to imagine that if an object could be held symbolically responsible, then perhaps an animal, which possesses a degree of agency and life, could also be viewed in a similar light. Indeed, Draco's law code in Athens, late 7th century BCE, reportedly included provisions for the trial of animals or objects that had caused death. This historical fact, though the specifics are debated, suggests an early Greek grappling with the concept of non-human agency in harm. What about ancient Egypt, with its deep reverence for certain sacred animals? You've already seen how harming a sacred cat could lead to severe punishment for the human involved. But what if an animal itself transgressed or was involved in a negative event? While direct evidence of formal animal trials is scarce, the strong belief in animals as manifestations or agents of divine powers could lead to complex ritual responses if, for example, a sacred bull behaved erratically or an animal associated with an evil deity caused harm. The response might be more ritualistic appeasement or purification rather than a trial, but it still involved treating the animal as more than just a dumb beast. In the Hebrew Bible, there are instances where animals are implicated in legal or ritual contexts. The most famous is perhaps the law in Exodus 21:28. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be acquitted. This law, while primarily focused on the owner's liability, or lack thereof, if the ox was not previously known to be dangerous, clearly prescribes a punishment for the animal itself, death by stoning. The prohibition against eating its flesh further suggests a kind of ritual condemnation of the animal. The precise philosophical or theological underpinnings of holding animals legally accountable are a subject of much scholarly fascination. Was it a belief that animals possessed a degree of moral understanding? Was it an attempt to restore cosmic balance when harm had been done, regardless of the perpetrator's species? Or was it a way for human communities to assert their dominance and control over the natural world, even in the face of unpredictable animal behavior? It's likely a combination of factors, varying across cultures and time periods. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of practices bordering on animal culpability involves ancient scapegoat rituals, found in various forms in the Near East and Mediterranean. The most famous is the biblical Day of Atonement ritual, where one goat was sacrificed, and another, the scapegoat, had the sins of the community symbolically placed upon its head, and was then driven out into the wilderness to carry those sins away. While not a trial of the goat, it certainly involves the animal as a ritual participant in a process of expiation and legal moral cleansing for the human community. Imagine the scene, a medieval European village, as this is where the practice became most elaborate, though we're peeking from an ancient perspective at its roots. A pig has fatally injured a child. The pig is arrested, imprisoned, and brought before a human court. Witnesses are called, evidence is presented, and a lawyer might even be appointed to defend the pig. If found guilty, the pig could be formally sentenced to death by hanging or burning, sometimes even dressed in human clothes for the occasion. We have actual court records from the 13th to the 18th centuries detailing such trials for pigs, cows, horses, dogs, and even insects like weevils or locusts, which might be excommunicated by an ecclesiastical court if they were destroying crops. While these full-blown medieval animal trials are a later development, the ancient world laid some of the conceptual groundwork by not always drawing a sharp, clear line between human and animal agency, especially when it came to harm, pollution, or ritual significance. The idea that an animal could be more than just property that it could be an actor in a moral or cosmic drama, even if a subordinate one, is a fascinating thread that runs through many ancient belief systems. So, as you ponder these perplexing instances, where the usually clear boundary between human justice and the animal kingdom seems to blur, you get a glimpse into a worldview very different from our own. It's a world where the legal and moral order was perhaps seen as encompassing all living creatures, or at least where the ritual consequences of an animal's actions could be taken with utmost seriousness. It certainly makes you look at your own dog, perhaps peacefully snoozing at the foot of your bed, in a slightly different and hopefully much less legally anxious light. Leaving the rather surreal image of an animal defendant in an ancient or medieval courtroom, you now drift into a realm of legal enactments so wonderfully specific, so exquisitely niche, or so downright bizarre from our modern perspective that their original purpose seems to have evaporated entirely, lost to the swirling mists of time. Prepare yourself for a sleepy parade of these utterly unfathomable edicts, the legislative head-scratchers of antiquity, rules that make you tilt your head and murmur, "But why?" into your pillow. These are the laws that defy easy explanation, the forgotten footnotes of jurisprudence that nonetheless offer a tantalizing, if perplexing, glimpse into the minds of our ancestors. Imagine an ancient city-state, perhaps a lesser-known Greek polis, or a remote Roman provincial town, where a very particular local problem has arisen, or a deeply ingrained, but now obscure, local custom has been enshrined in law. These aren't the grand pronouncements on justice or empire. These are the quirky bylaws, the hyperlocal regulations that govern the minutiae of daily life in ways that can seem almost comical to us today. Consider, for instance, the sheer specificity of some ancient building regulations that went beyond simple safety. While rules about fire breaks or building heights are understandable, you might occasionally stumble upon references to laws dictating the precise orientation of a new temple down to the degree, or the exact type of wood to be used, for the threshold of a public building, not for structural reasons, but for purely ritualistic or symbolic ones that are no longer clear to us, or perhaps a law specifying the maximum number of statues one could erect in honor of a victorious athlete, not to curb extravagance in general, but because a particular athlete had become a bit too popular for someone's liking. The mainstream, historical fact is that ancient societies often embedded deeply symbolic or religious meanings into their architecture and urban planning, which could lead to very specific, and to us, opaque building codes. Then there are the laws that seem to regulate incredibly trivial social interactions. What if there was an ancient law in a small community against, say, excessive whistling after sunset, because it was believed to disturb the nocturnal spirits of the nearby sacred grove? Or a rule prohibiting the wearing of shoes made from the hide of a particular animal, not because the animal was sacred, but because of some long-forgotten local feud or a single, unfortunate incident involving such shoes decades earlier. These are hypothetical, of course, but they capture the flavor of the kind of hyper-specific, context-dependent laws that often don't survive in the grand historical narratives, but likely littered the legal landscape of smaller, more insular communities. One area ripe for unfathomable edicts is anything to do with rituals and omens, which you've already explored. But sometimes the laws weren't just about performing rituals correctly, but about preventing actions that might inadvertently trigger a bad omen. Imagine a law forbidding the carrying of unplucked chickens upside down through the marketplace on a Tuesday. Why? Perhaps someone once did so, and a terrible storm followed, and the two events became inexorably linked in the local psyche, leading to a very specific, and to outsiders, utterly baffling, prohibition. The precise origins of such highly localized and specific taboos are often impossible to reconstruct, making them prime candidates for our utterly unfathomable category. Sometimes these peculiar laws arise from attempts to solve a very real problem, but with a solution that seems disproportionate or strangely targeted. For example, if a particular type of street performance became a nuisance, instead of a general law against disruptive performances, you might find a law specifically banning, say, the playing of the double flute by by men with red hair between the hours of noon and mid-afternoon in the vicinity of the fish market. The specificity makes you wonder about the particular red-haired, flute-playing fish market enthusiast who prompted such a targeted piece of legislation. A quirky, lesser-known category of potentially unfathomable edicts might involve laws surrounding very specific local cults or deities whose attributes and requirements are no longer fully understood. Perhaps the priestesses of the local nymph of the murky pond were forbidden by ancient law from eating lentils on days when the wind blew from the east. Without understanding the full mythology and ritual context of that specific nymph, such a law would appear utterly nonsensical. Many ancient religions had a plethora of minor, local deities, each with their own unique, and often unrecorded, set of ritual demands. It is a subject of much scholarly amusement and sometimes frustration when historians encounter legal fragments or references that clearly point to a specific prohibition or regulation, but the surviving text is too damaged or the context too obscure to fully understand what was being legislated or why. These are the true ghosts in the legal machine, tantalizing hints of forgotten social norms and anxieties. What about laws that seem to contradict common sense, even by ancient standards? Perhaps a law that required farmers to plant a certain, notoriously unproductive crop in a particular field every 7 years, simply because it had always been done that way, a tradition whose original agricultural or religious purpose had long since vanished, leaving only the fossilized, and now counterproductive legal requirement. Bureaucracy and the dead hand of tradition are not modern inventions, after all. As you drift through this parade of the perplexing, the overly specific, and the downright weird, you realize that the ancient world was not a monolithic entity. It was a patchwork of countless communities, each with its own history, its own beliefs, its own unique set of problems, and consequently, its own unique, and sometimes utterly unfathomable, set of rules. These are the laws that don't make it into the grand textbooks of legal history, the ones that are whispered about in footnotes or debated by specialists. But they offer a wonderfully humanizing glimpse into the past, reminding us that ancient peoples, for all their differences, shared our capacity for creating rules that, with the passage of time and the loss of context, can seem delightfully and sleepily absurd. The original purpose of that law about the upside-down chicken may be lost to the mists of time, but the image it conjures certainly makes for a memorable, if baffling, historical tidbit. The sleepy parade of unfathomable ancient edicts, those legal puzzles whose original purposes are lost to the mists of time, now leads us to consider a rather more sobering, yet equally fascinating aspect of ancient justice: the punishments. Having explored some of the wonderfully weird things that could get you into trouble, we now calmly consider the often creative, sometimes frankly alarming, and occasionally disproportionate penalties meted out for breaking these ancient rules, whether those rules were seemingly silly and minor or gravely serious. This is where the abstract nature of law met the often harsh reality of its enforcement, and where ancient societies revealed a great deal about their values, their fears, and their concepts of retribution and deterrence. You've already encountered some of the sterner penalties in Hammurabi's code: the eye for an eye principle, the drowning of adulterous wives, or the rather grim fate of the negligent builder and his unfortunate son. But the Mesopotamians were hardly unique in their capacity for severe punishments. Many ancient societies employed a range of physical sanctions that would make us shudder today. Flogging, or beating with rods, was a common punishment for a wide variety of offences, from theft to insubordination, across cultures from Egypt to Rome. The number of lashes could be specified by law, a painful and public form of retribution. Mutilation was another frequently employed penalty, designed not just to punish but also to permanently mark the offender. In ancient Egypt, as you heard, cutting off the nose or ears was a punishment for certain crimes, including some forms of theft or adultery. In Assyrian law, known for its particular harshness, a range of mutilations were prescribed: lips cut off for slander, hands for theft, castration for certain sexual offences. These weren't just about inflicting pain, they were about shaming. the individual and serving as a constant, visible warning to others. This use of judicial mutilation as a public deterrent is a well-documented mainstream historical fact in many ancient Near Eastern and later societies. Forced labor was another common sentence, especially for those who couldn't pay fines or for more serious, but not necessarily capital, crimes. This could mean being condemned to work in the brutal conditions of state-owned mines, a virtual death sentence in many cases given the horrific conditions, toiling on large public works projects, like building temples or fortifications, or even being enslaved as a penalty for debt or certain offences. And then, of course, there was the death penalty, applied for a wide range of crimes that varied from culture to culture. Methods of execution were often designed to be as public and as terrifying as possible. Hanging, beheading, stoning, as prescribed for the goring ox in the Hebrew Bible, and for certain human offences in various cultures. Burning alive, sometimes used for sacrilege or treason. Drowning, as for some adulteresses in Hammurabi's code. Or even crucifixion, a notoriously cruel and prolonged method favoured by the Romans for certain classes of criminals, particularly slaves and rebels, were all part of the grim repertoire. But what about punishments for breaking some of those more peculiar laws? It's not always the case that a silly-sounding law would have an equally silly punishment. Sometimes, an offence that seems minor to us, like violating a religious taboo or a sumptuary law, could carry surprisingly severe penalties if it was seen as a threat to social order, divine favour, or state authority. For instance, if wearing the wrong colour of toga was a direct affront to the emperor's status, the punishment might be far more than a simple fine. However, ancient legal systems also employed a wide range of less brutal, though still impactful, penalties. Fines were very common, often scaled according to the nature of the offence and the social status of both the offender and the victim. Confiscation of property was another powerful tool. Exile, as you saw with Athenian ostracism, could be a devastating punishment, effectively cutting an individual off from their community, their livelihood, and their ancestral gods. Public shaming rituals, such as being paraded through the streets in a humiliating fashion, or being forced to wear a sign proclaiming one's offence, could also be highly effective deterrents in societies where personal honour and reputation were paramount. One quirky, lesser-known category of ancient punishment or legal consequence involved ritual purification or expiation. If someone had, even accidentally, violated a religious taboo or caused some form of ritual pollution, like coming into contact with a corpse, as you heard in Rome, they might be required to undergo specific cleansing ceremonies, offer sacrifices, or observe a period of isolation before they could be readmitted to normal society or sacred spaces. This wasn't punishment in the retributive sense, but rather a necessary step to restore spiritual balance and appease the offended deities. The precise nature of these purification rituals varied enormously, but highlights the deep connection between law, religion, and concepts of purity in the ancient world. It's also important to remember that the application of justice was rarely uniform. Social status, wealth, gender, and whether one was a citizen or a foreigner, a free person or a slave, almost invariably influenced both the likelihood of conviction and the severity of the punishment. The eye for an eye might apply if a nobleman injured another nobleman. But if a nobleman injured a commoner or a slave, the penalty was often a monetary fine, and a much smaller one at that. This disparity in justice, based on social hierarchy, is a stark reminder that equality before the law is a relatively modern concept. The exact rationale behind some of the more creative or seemingly disproportionate punishments is sometimes a subject of historical debate. Were they purely about deterrence, aiming to shock the populace into obedience? Were they rooted in deep-seated beliefs about sympathetic magic, e.g., cutting off the hand that stole? Or were they sometimes simply the result of a particular ruler's cruelty or a society's unexamined traditions? As you contemplate this rather grim catalogue of ancient penalties, from the public spectacle of a Roman crucifixion to the quiet devastation of exile from one's homeland, you see a world where justice could be swift, harsh, and often highly inventive. The punishments meted out, whether for breaking a profound moral law or a seemingly unfathomable local ordinance, speak volumes about what these ancient societies valued, what they feared, and the often alarming lengths they would go to in order to maintain their particular vision of order. The chilling echoes of those ancient punishments, the floggings, the mutilations, the public executions, begin to fade, and your attention shifts from the formally inscribed laws on stone or papyrus to a more subtle, yet often equally powerful, realm of social control. Beyond the written statutes and codified edicts, ancient lives were profoundly governed by a vast network of unwritten rules, unspoken expectations, and deeply ingrained social customs and taboos. These invisible laws, while not found in any law book, often carried the unyielding force of legal pronouncements, shaping behavior, dictating choices, and ensuring conformity with an efficacy that sometimes surpassed that of formal legislation. Imagine yourself living in any ancient community, from a small Mesopotamian village to a bustling Greek polis or a sprawling Roman neighborhood. You quickly learn that it's not enough to simply avoid breaking the official laws. There's a whole other layer of rules you need to navigate. The rules of custom, tradition, and social propriety. Violating these might not land you in front of a magistrate, but it could result in social ostracism, ridicule, loss of reputation, or even the withdrawal of community support. Penalties that, in a small, tightly knit society, could be as devastating as any formal legal sanction. Consider the powerful role of honor and shame in many ancient Mediterranean cultures. Maintaining one's personal honor and that of one's family was of paramount importance. A public insult, a perceived slight, a failure to fulfill social obligations. These could all bring shame, not just upon the individual, but upon their entire lineage. This deep-seated concern for honor and the avoidance of shame, a mainstream historical fact particularly emphasized in studies of ancient Greek and Roman societies, acted as a powerful internal and external regulator of behavior, often more effective than any written law against, say, rudeness or inconsiderate actions. You wouldn't want to be the person whose family was known for its lack of hospitality or its failure to avenge an insult. Hospitality, xenia in Greek, hospitium in Latin, was a sacred duty in many ancient cultures, governed by complex unwritten rules. How you treated a guest, even an unknown stranger, or how you behaved as a guest in someone else's home, was a serious matter. Breaching these rules of hospitality could bring divine displeasure, as Zeus Xenios was the protector of guests, and certainly social condemnation. Stories abound in ancient literature of the dire consequences that befell those who violated these sacred obligations. Respect for elders was another deeply ingrained unwritten law. In most ancient societies, age was equated with wisdom and authority. Younger members of the community were expected to show deference to their elders, to listen to their counsel, and to care for them in their old age. Failing to do so would be a serious breach of social decorum and filial piety, inviting widespread disapproval. Gender roles, too, were largely governed by unwritten, yet incredibly powerful, social expectations. While some laws might touch upon aspects of marriage or inheritance, the day-to-day behavior deemed appropriate for men and women, their spheres of activity, their public comportment, their dress, their speech, was primarily dictated by deeply entrenched cultural norms. A Roman matron was expected to be modest, chaste, and dedicated to her household, domus. A man was expected to be brave, politically active, if a citizen, and the master of his family. Deviations from these prescribed roles could lead to gossip, scandal, and social marginalization. The precise nature and rigidity of these gender roles, of course, varied across different ancient cultures and social classes, and are a constant subject of historical investigation. Religious observance, beyond the specific laws against impiety or sacrilege, was also shot through with countless unspoken expectations, attending certain festivals, making appropriate offerings at household shrines, observing periods of ritual purity. These were often matters of custom and communal expectation, rather than explicit legal command for every individual. Yet, failing to participate or participating incorrectly could mark one as impious, unlucky, or simply not one of us. One quirky, lesser-known example of the power of unwritten rules might involve local superstitions or folk beliefs that dictated everyday actions. For instance, in a particular village, it might be considered incredibly unlucky to begin a journey if a certain type of bird was heard calling from a specific direction at dawn. There's no law against it, but no sensible villager would ignore such a warning, lest they be blamed for any misfortune that subsequently befell them or the community. These small localized taboos, passed down through generations, could be incredibly binding. Even something as simple as table manners, as you touched upon with ancient Irish crimes of the lips, was often governed by unwritten rules of etiquette. How you ate, what you talked about at the table, how much you drank. All of these could contribute to your social standing and how you were perceived by your peers. A boorish or gluttonous individual might find themselves excluded from future invitations, a subtle but effective form of social punishment. And then, of course, there was the death penalty, applied for a wide range of crimes that varied from culture to culture. Methods of execution were often designed to be as public and as terrifying as possible. Hanging, beheading, stoning, as prescribed for the goring ox in the Hebrew Bible, and for certain human offenses in various cultures. Burning alive, sometimes used for sacrilege or treason. Drowning, as for some adulteresses in Hammurabi's code. Or even crucifixion, a notoriously cruel and prolonged method favored by the Romans for certain classes of criminals, particularly slaves and rebels, were all part of the grim repertoire. But what about punishments for breaking some of those more peculiar laws? It's not always the case that a silly-sounding law would have an equally silly punishment. Sometimes, an offense that seems minor to us, like violating a religious taboo or a sumptuary law, could carry surprisingly severe penalties if it was seen as a threat to social order, divine favor, or state authority. For instance, if wearing the wrong color of toga was a direct affront to the emperor's status, the punishment might be far more than a simple fine. However, ancient legal systems also employed a wide range of less brutal, though still impactful, penalties. Fines were very common, often scaled according to the nature of the offense and the social status of both the offender and the victim. Confiscation of property was another powerful tool. Exile, as you saw with Athenian ostracism, could be a devastating punishment, effectively cutting an individual off from their community, their livelihood, and their ancestral gods. Public shaming rituals, such as being paraded through the streets in a humiliating fashion, or being forced to wear a sign proclaiming one's offense, could also be highly effective deterrents in societies where personal honor and reputation were paramount. One quirky, lesser-known category of ancient punishment or legal consequence involved ritual purification or expiation. If someone had, even accidentally, violated a religious taboo or caused some form of ritual pollution, like coming into contact with a corpse, as you heard in Rome, they might be required to undergo specific cleansing ceremonies, offer sacrifices, or observe a period of isolation before they could be readmitted to normal society or sacred spaces. This wasn't punishment in the retributive sense, but rather a necessary step to restore spiritual balance and appease the offended deities. The precise nature of these purification rituals varied enormously, but highlights the deep connection between law, religion, and concepts of purity in the ancient world. It's also important to remember that the application of justice was rarely uniform. Social status, wealth, gender, and whether one was a citizen or a foreigner, a free person or a slave, almost invariably influenced both the likelihood of conviction and the severity of the punishment. The eye for an eye might apply if a nobleman injured another nobleman. But if a nobleman injured a commoner or a slave, the penalty was often a monetary fine, and a much smaller one at that. This disparity in justice, based on social hierarchy, is a stark reminder that equality before the law is a relatively modern concept. The exact rationale behind some of the more creative or seemingly disproportionate punishments is sometimes a subject of historical debate. Were they purely about deterrence, aiming to shock the populace into obedience? Were they rooted in deep-seated beliefs about sympathetic magic, e.g., cutting off the hand that stole? Or were they sometimes simply the result of a particular ruler's cruelty or a society's unexamined traditions? As you contemplate this rather grim catalogue of ancient penalties, from the public spectacle of a Roman crucifixion to the quiet devastation of exile from one's homeland, you see a world where justice could be swift, harsh, and often highly inventive. The punishments meted out, whether for breaking a profound moral law or a seemingly unfathomable local ordinance, speak volumes about what these ancient societies valued, what they feared, and the often alarming lengths they would go to in order to maintain their particular vision of order. The chilling echoes of those ancient punishments, the floggings, the mutilations, the public executions, begin to fade, and your attention shifts from the formally inscribed laws on stone or papyrus to a more subtle, yet often equally powerful, realm of social control. Beyond the written statutes and codified edicts, ancient lives were profoundly governed by a vast network of unwritten rules, unspoken expectations, and deeply ingrained social customs and taboos. These invisible laws, while not found in any law book, often carried the unyielding force of legal pronouncements, shaping behavior, dictating choices, and ensuring conformity with an efficacy that sometimes surpassed that of formal legislation. Imagine yourself living in any ancient community, from a small Mesopotamian village to a bustling Greek polis or a sprawling Roman neighborhood. You quickly learn that it's not enough to simply avoid breaking the official laws. There's a whole other layer of rules you need to navigate. The rules of custom, tradition, and social propriety. Violating these might not land you in front of a magistrate, but it could result in social ostracism, ridicule, loss of reputation, or even the withdrawal of community support. Penalties that, in a small, tightly knit society, could be as devastating as any formal legal sanction. Consider the powerful role of honor and shame in many ancient Mediterranean cultures. Maintaining one's personal honor and that of one's family was of paramount importance. A public insult, a perceived slight, a failure to fulfill social obligations. These could all bring shame, not just upon the individual, but upon their entire lineage. This deep-seated concern for honor and the avoidance of shame, a mainstream historical fact particularly emphasized in studies of ancient Greek and Roman societies, acted as a powerful internal and external regulator of behavior, often more effective than any written law against, say, rudeness or inconsiderate actions. You wouldn't want to be the person whose family was known for its lack of hospitality or its failure to avenge an insult. Hospitality, xenia in Greek, hospitium in Latin, was a sacred duty in many ancient cultures, governed by complex unwritten rules. How you treated a guest, even an unknown stranger, or how you behaved as a guest in someone else's home, was a serious matter. Breaching these rules of hospitality could bring divine displeasure, as Zeus Xenios was the protector of guests, and certainly social condemnation. Stories abound in ancient literature of the dire consequences that befell those who violated these sacred obligations. Respect for elders was another deeply ingrained unwritten law. In most ancient societies, age was equated with wisdom and authority. Younger members of the community were expected to show deference to their elders, to listen to their counsel, and to care for them in their old age. Failing to do so would be a serious breach of social decorum and filial piety, inviting widespread disapproval. Gender roles, too, were largely governed by unwritten, yet incredibly powerful, social expectations. While some laws might touch upon aspects of marriage or inheritance, the day-to-day behavior deemed appropriate for men and women, their spheres of activity, their public comportment, their dress, their speech, was primarily dictated by deeply entrenched cultural norms. A Roman matron was expected to be modest, chaste, and dedicated to her household, domus. A man was expected to be brave, politically active, if a citizen, and the master of his family. Deviations from these prescribed roles could lead to gossip, scandal, and social marginalization. The precise nature and rigidity of these gender roles, of course, varied across different ancient cultures and social classes, and are a constant subject of historical investigation. Religious observance, beyond the specific laws against impiety or sacrilege, was also shot through with countless unspoken expectations, attending certain festivals, making appropriate offerings at household shrines, observing periods of ritual purity. These were often matters of custom and communal expectation, rather than explicit legal command for every individual. Yet, failing to participate or participating incorrectly could mark one as impious, unlucky, or simply not one of us. One quirky, lesser-known example of the power of unwritten rules might involve local superstitions or folk beliefs that dictated everyday actions. For instance, in a particular village, it might be considered incredibly unlucky to begin a journey if a certain type of bird was heard calling from a specific direction at dawn. There's no law against it, but no sensible villager would ignore such a warning, lest they be blamed for any misfortune that subsequently befell them or the community. These small localized taboos, passed down through generations, could be incredibly binding. Even something as simple as table manners, as you touched upon with ancient Irish crimes of the lips, was often governed by unwritten rules of etiquette. How you ate, what you talked about at the table, how much you drank. All of these could contribute to your social standing and how you were perceived by your peers. A boorish or gluttonous individual might find themselves excluded from future invitations, a subtle but effective form of social punishment. These unwritten rules, these unyielding expectations, formed a dense web of social control that complemented and sometimes even superseded the formal legal system. They were learned from childhood, absorbed through observation, stories, and the subtle and not so subtle reactions of others. They provided a shared understanding of how to behave, how to interact, and how to maintain one's place within the community. While the penalties for breaking them might not involve a flogging or a fine, the power of social disapproval, the fear of ridicule, and the threat of ostracism were often more than enough to keep most people in line. As you navigate these ancient societies, you realize that the most important laws were not always the ones carved in stone, but the ones etched into the hearts and minds of the people. Section 13. The subtle, yet powerful web of unwritten social rules and unspoken expectations begins to coalesce with another, equally significant, layer of ancient regulation. The direct commands and prohibitions believed to emanate from the divine realm, beyond the human-made laws, whether sensible or silly, and the unyielding customs of society. Ancient lives were profoundly shaped by divine decrees and heavenly headaches, a complex system of religious prohibitions, sacred obligations, and ritual requirements that carried immense weight, often with the perceived backing of supernatural enforcement, ensuring the gods remained content and the mortals appropriately anxious about fulfilling their sacred duties, was a fundamental concern that permeated every aspect of life. Imagine yourself in any ancient temple precinct, the air thick with incense, the sound of chanting priests, and the palpable sense of divine presence. Here, the rules were not made by mortal kings or assemblies. They were believed to be ordained by the gods themselves, communicated through oracles, sacred texts, or priestly traditions. Violating these divine decrees wasn't just a crime against the state. It was a sin, an act of sacrilege that could bring down not just personal misfortune, but divine wrath upon the entire community. Plague, famine, drought, or military defeat. This fear of collective punishment for individual impiety was a powerful motivator for adherence to religious law. Consider the concept of ritual purity, which was central to many ancient religions. Before approaching a sacred site, participating in a religious festival, or performing a sacrifice, individuals often had to be in a state of ritual cleanliness. This might involve abstaining from certain foods, refraining from sexual activity, undergoing purification rites like washing with sacred water, or avoiding contact with anything deemed polluting, such as a corpse. The specific requirements varied greatly, But the underlying principle was the same. The gods demanded purity from those who approached them. Failure to observe these purity laws could invalidate a ritual, offend the deity, and have dire consequences. These purity codes, often incredibly detailed, are a mainstream historical fact of most ancient religious systems. Then there were the direct prohibitions. Thou shalt not, commands that forbade certain actions deemed offensive to the gods. These could range from the profound moral injunctions of the Ten Commandments in the Hebrew tradition, e.g., thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, to more ritualistic or seemingly arbitrary prohibitions. For example, in some ancient Greek cults, it might be forbidden to bring iron into a sacred grove, or to wear woolen garments in a particular temple. The reasoning behind these specific taboos is not always clear to us, but for the ancients, they were divine commands to be obeyed without question. Sacred obligations were equally important. These were the positive duties required of mortals, to honor the gods and maintain the pax deorum, the peace of the gods. This included offering regular sacrifices, animal, grain, wine, incense, reciting prayers and hymns, observing holy days and festivals, and maintaining the temples and shrines dedicated to the deities. Neglecting these duties was a serious offense, a form of divine ingratitude that could lead to the withdrawal of divine favor. The calendar of many ancient societies was packed with religious festivals, each with its own specific rituals and obligations that the community was expected to observe. Oracles and divination, which you've encountered before, often delivered what were perceived as direct divine decrees or warnings. If the oracle at Delphi pronounced that a certain course of action would anger Apollo, or if an augur interpreted the flight of birds as a sign of Jupiter's disapproval for a planned military campaign, these pronouncements would carry immense weight, often overriding purely political or practical considerations. To ignore a clear divine message was to court disaster. One quirky, lesser-known aspect of divine decrees involved sacred laws, inscribed in temples or on boundary stones, detailing specific rules for a particular sanctuary or cult. These might include lists of forbidden actions within the sacred precinct, the proper procedures for offering sacrifices, the fees payable to the priests, or even the genealogies of the priestly families. These inscriptions served as public declarations of the god's will and the rules of their domain. The precise legal status of these sacred laws, whether they were enforced by human courts or solely by divine retribution, is a complex question that varied across cultures and is still studied by epigraphers and historians of ancient religion. What happened if you broke one of these divine decrees? The perceived consequences could be dire, beyond any human punishment that might be meted out by priests or magistrates for impiety. The real fear was of supernatural retribution. This could take the form of personal misfortune, illness, financial ruin, childlessness, natural disasters afflicting the community, or even punishment in the afterlife, depending on the culture's beliefs about post-mortem judgment. The anxiety of unknowingly offending a god, or of failing to perform a ritual correctly, would have been a constant undercurrent in many ancient lives. As you stand in the shadowy, incense-filled interior of an ancient temple, surrounded by images of powerful and often inscrutable deities, you can feel the weight of these heavenly headaches. The need to constantly interpret divine will, to perform rituals with exacting precision, to observe countless prohibitions, and to live in a way that was pleasing to a pantheon of often demanding gods, must have been an exhausting, anxiety-inducing endeavor. These divine decrees, whether whispered by oracles, thundered from mountaintops, or quietly inscribed on temple walls, formed an invisible yet unbreakable framework around ancient lives, ensuring that the gods remained a constant and, often very demanding, presence in every human affair. Section 14, the scent of sacred incense and the weight of divine decrees begin to dissipate, and your mind, now filled with a curious collection of ancient rules both bizarre and profound, turns to a more reflective, analytical mood. You find yourself gently pondering the why behind it all. What mindsets, what beliefs, What deeply ingrained societal anxieties might have birthed such a wonderfully weird and extraordinarily diverse array of legislation in those bygone eras? As you decode these ancient decrees, you're not just looking at laws. You're looking into the very heart of how ancient peoples understood their world, their gods, and themselves. One of the most fundamental drivers, as you've touched upon repeatedly, was the pervasive influence of religion and superstition. In a world where natural phenomena were often attributed to the actions of capricious gods, spirits, or other supernatural forces, many laws were designed not just to regulate human behavior, but to maintain cosmic order and appease these unseen powers. A law against wearing a certain color, eating a particular food on a specific day, or performing an action deemed unlucky might seem irrational to us, but if it was believed to prevent a drought, a plague, or a military defeat by keeping the gods happy, then it made perfect sense within that belief system. The line between secular law and religious observance was often non-existent. Many laws were, in essence, divinely sanctioned behavioral codes. Social hierarchy and the maintenance of power structures also played a massive role. Sumptuary laws, those detailed regulations about clothing, food, and public display you've explored, were often less about morality and more about visually reinforcing class distinctions. If only senators could wear a broad purple stripe on their toga, or only royalty could consume a particular rare delicacy, it immediately marked them out, solidifying their elite status and reminding everyone else of their place in the social pecking order. Laws that restricted access to certain professions, or that prescribed different punishments for the same crime based on social rank, all served to uphold and perpetuate these deeply stratified societies. This use of law to maintain social hierarchy is a mainstream historical fact evident in nearly all ancient civilizations. The sheer need for social cohesion and order in rapidly growing or densely populated communities also spurred a great deal of legislation. As villages grew into towns and towns into sprawling cities, informal social controls were no longer sufficient. You needed explicit rules to manage everything from market transactions and property disputes to public nuisances like noise or waste disposal. Many of the laws that seem overly specific to us might have been direct responses to very real, very practical problems of urban living in a pre-industrial age. That seemingly odd rule about not throwing your refuse out of an upper-story window, probably born from too many unfortunate pedestrians getting an unwelcome shower. Fear of the other or the foreign was another powerful motivator. Laws that restricted the dress, customs, or religious practices of foreigners, or that limited their rights and interactions with citizens, were common. These weren't always born of pure xenophobia. Sometimes they were attempts to preserve a community's distinct cultural identity, or to prevent the perceived corruption of traditional values by outside influences. But they often resulted in discriminatory and peculiar regulations that targeted specific groups. The desire to control aspects of life that felt uncontrollable also led to some strange laws. Think about laws related to omens, dreams, or divination. In a world without scientific explanations for misfortune, trying to legislate how one should react to a bad dream, or what rituals to perform after seeing an unlucky bird, was an attempt to exert some measure of control over an uncertain future. If you couldn't stop the lightning, perhaps you could at least have a law about how to properly purify the spot where it struck. Sometimes, laws were simply the product of tradition and inertia. A rule might have been put in place centuries earlier, for a very specific, long-forgotten reason, but it remained on the books, and people continued to observe it, or at least pay lip service to it, simply because it has always been done this way. This reverence for ancestral custom, even when the original rationale was lost, was a powerful force in many ancient societies. The precise reasons why some outdated or seemingly irrational laws persisted for so long, even when their original context was gone, is a fascinating area of study for legal historians, often pointing to the conservative nature of legal systems. And let's not forget the role of powerful individuals, kings, emperors, influential priests, or charismatic lawgivers. Sometimes, a peculiar law might simply reflect the personal obsession, a pet peeve, or the political agenda of a particular ruler. If the pharaoh had a particular dislike for, say, beards, a hypothetical, of course, as many were bearded, he might just issue a decree, and suddenly, a clean-shaven face becomes the law of the land, or at least the fashion at court. The quirks of individual leaders could, and did, leave their mark on the legal codes. One quirky, lesser-known factor that might have contributed to some odd laws was the process of legal borrowing and adaptation. As cultures interacted, they often adopted or adapted laws from their neighbors. Sometimes, a law that made perfect sense in one cultural context might seem rather strange or be misapplied when transplanted to another, leading to some peculiar legal hybrids. Ultimately, decoding these ancient decrees requires us to step into the mindset of the people who created and lived by them. It means understanding their cosmology, their social structures, their daily anxieties, and their deepest beliefs. The laws they made, no matter how weird they seem to us, were their attempts to build a coherent, ordered, and meaningful world. They reflect a human desire for justice, for security, and for a sense of control, even if the methods they chose sometimes strike us as profoundly peculiar. By pondering the why behind these wonderfully weird legislations, we're not just learning about ancient laws, we're learning about the enduring and often endearingly strange complexities of human nature itself. The echoes of those ancient mindsets, the religious anxieties, the hierarchical obsessions, and the pragmatic attempts to impose order on a chaotic world now begin to soften. Your journey through the creaking law books of antiquity, filled with rules both profoundly influential and profoundly peculiar, is drawing to a gentle close. As you reflect on humanity's long, strange, and often hilariously specific relationship with rulemaking, you might find yourself chuckling softly, not just at the legal absurdities of our ancestors, but perhaps also at the faint, lingering echoes of that same impulse in our own, supposedly more rational, modern world. You've wandered through the dusty marketplaces of Mesopotamia, where the price of a gored ox was meticulously legislated, and a careless builder could lose more than just his reputation. You floated down the Nile, into a land where harming a sacred cat was a capital offense, and where even the decibel level of your grief might be subject to scrutiny. You've strolled through the agoras of Greece, witnessing Athenian citizens ostracize their leaders with potsherds and Spartan youths being encouraged to steal their dinner, but only if they were sneaky about it. You've navigated the forums of Rome, where the color of your toga could speak volumes, and where an ill-timed stumble on your doorstep could ruin your entire day. You've unraveled ancient attire acts that would make a modern fashionista weep with frustration, and nibbled your way through culinary codes that dictated dinner with divine authority. You've cringed at public panics policed by rules against noisy sandals, perhaps, and excessive wailing. You've even peeked into courtrooms, where, incredibly, animals face justice, or at least a human approximation of it. You've marveled at those utterly unfathomable edicts whose original purpose seems to have dissolved into the mists of time, leaving only a delightful sense of bewilderment. And you've calmly considered the often peculiar and sometimes alarming punishments that awaited those who dared to transgress these ancient statutes, whether silly or serious. You've also seen how the unwritten rules of custom and the profound weight of divine decrees shaped ancient lives with an iron, if invisible, hand. What does this restful review of ridiculous rules tell us? It tells us that the human urge to create order, to define boundaries, and to regulate behavior is ancient and deeply ingrained. It tells us that societies, in their quest for stability and harmony, or at least their leaders' vision of it, have often resorted to methods that, with the passage of time and the shift in cultural perspectives, can appear utterly bizarre. It reveals a charming, if sometimes unsettling, human tendency to micromanage, to codify the seemingly trivial, and to imbue everyday actions with profound, often superstitious significance. This tendency for societies to develop highly specific and sometimes seemingly irrational rules and rituals is a mainstream historical and anthropological observation. seen across nearly all cultures to varying degrees. But perhaps it also tells us something a little more comforting. It shows us that even in the most rigid and rule-bound societies, there was likely a degree of human adaptability, a quiet finding of loopholes, a resigned sigh, or even a secret, rebellious chuckle at the more absurd pronouncements from on high. The historical record often focuses on the laws themselves, but the lived experience of navigating those laws, of conforming, resisting, or simply trying to get by, is a quieter, more nuanced story. One quirky, final thought as you drift. Consider how many of our own modern laws and social conventions might seem utterly baffling or hilariously specific to someone looking back from a few millennia in the future. Our intricate tax codes, our oddly specific traffic regulations, our unwritten rules of digital etiquette, might these not be the unfathomable edicts of tomorrow's sleepy History Channel? The precise mechanisms by which future historians will interpret our present-day normal customs and laws is, of course, a matter of pure speculation, but it's a humbling thought. The legal absurdities of our ancestors, from Hammurabi's specific penalties for tavern-keeping conspirators to Roman rules about funeral flautists, offer more than just amusement. They offer a connection, a shared human experience of trying to make sense of the world and live together, even if our methods sometimes stray into the wonderfully weird. They remind us that for all our technological advancements and scientific understanding, the fundamental human desire for order and our occasional talent for achieving it in the most peculiar ways remains a constant. As the last of these ancient laws fades from your mind, replaced by the gentle quiet of your own surroundings, perhaps you can take with you a sense of bemused affection for those who came before us, those diligent, anxious, and often unintentionally hilarious rule-makers of antiquity. Their world was different, their anxieties were different, but their humanity, in all its complex rule-making glory, shines through. The heavy, dusty tomes of ancient law now gently, close, their strange and solemn pronouncements fading into the quiet hum of the night. The images of stern Mesopotamian kings, divine Egyptian pharaohs, argumentative Greek philosophers, and pragmatic Roman senators, all diligently crafting their rules for life, begin to soften and dissolve, like ink on ancient parchment exposed to the morning sun. Their world, so meticulously ordered, so wonderfully weird, can now recede into the peaceful mists of history. Allow your mind to drift away from the thought of peculiar punishments and unfathomable edicts. Let go of the anxiety of accidentally wearing the wrong-colored toga or offending a sacred cat. Instead, feel the simple, uncomplicated comfort of your own bed, the gentle support beneath you, the steady, quiet rhythm of your own breath. The complex legal codes of the past, with all their intricacies and occasional absurdities, no longer apply. Here, in this serene space, there is only the